Well, hello, Park Road Church family. Welcome to another episode of Always Reforming. This is your opportunity to hear news and updates on the life of Park Road. And today we're beginning something a little bit different. We want to give you an overview of ECO, of our denomination, a covenant order of evangelical Presbyterians. And often ECO uses three words to describe themselves. And those words are Reformed, evangelical, and egalitarian. And those words may raise some questions for you. Maybe you're not familiar with one or more of them. So we're going to take 3 weeks and in 3 videos discuss one of those topics per video. And so this week we're going to talk with you a little bit about Reformed theology. So Lisa, what to you does it mean to believe in Reformed theology?
Yes, so Reformed is an umbrella term that covers an entire branch of churches that grew out of the Protestant Reformation. And it comes from the phrase reformed and always reforming. That is to say, we are always growing, always learning, and continually always being shaped by a living God. And in fact, that emphasis on continual learning and this emphasis on loving God with our minds is what initially drew me to the Reformed tradition. So Chris, why don't you give us a general overview of some of the major concepts in Reformed theology?
Yeah. So, shocker, churches argue. You're surprised, right? And churches have always argued. So the Protestant Reformation began in 1519 with Martin Luther and the 95 Theses. Maybe you learned about that in high school or in college. So there were the protesters who protested against the Catholic Church. And as the Protestant Reformation unfolded, there began to develop different streams of the Protestant Reformation. And so there were 2 distinct streams that were arguing. And so in 1618 and 1619, the Synod of Dort met in the city of Dort, I think the city of Dort, or Dorchester, I don't know. And they produced a document called the Canons of Dort, which I know is sitting by your bedside as enticing reading every single evening. Now, the Synod of Dort produced the Canons of Dort, which tend to be used to summarize Reformed theology using 5 points. And I think that Reformed theology is much more than these 5 points, but this is how we all often first hear about or what we think about when we think of Reformed theology. Now, those 5 points may sound familiar. They're usually referred to by the word tulip, because each letter refers to one of the points of the Canons of Dort. T stands for total depravity, that we are all sinners. Now, specifically, total depravity means that there is no part of the human that is untouched or unstained by sin. So, we don't believe that humans are as evil or sinful as they could be, but there is no part of us that is untouched or unstained by sin. Total depravity. The U stands for unconditional election, that God elects his children irrespective of anything they have done. There is nothing in us that earns or obtains salvation. It is a free gift of God. Salvation by God's grace through faith. We'll get back to grace in a second. So total depravity, unconditional election. The L is limited atonement. This can be a difficult one for some folks, a lot of folks, I think maybe all folks, to really wrestle with. Limited atonement teaches that Jesus died only for the elect. Now, again, that's a difficult concept. Theologian John Murray, in his book, Redemption Accomplished and Applied, writes about how Christ's death had to be limited either in scope or in efficacy. And I am really persuaded by that argument. Would love to dialogue more with you if you have questions. So T, total depravity. U, unconditional election. L, limited atonement. I, irresistible grace, that we are saved by grace, and that the elect cannot resist God's grace. And then P, the perseverance of the saints, which is great news that those who are born again will not lose their salvation and will persevere to the end. And that's the 5 points of Calvinism in a nutshell. I promise you, books have been written that are like several thousand pages, so this is just a really quick snapshot summary of Reformed theology.
Yes. And the Canons of Dort, the 5 points of Calvinism, it was really birthed in an era in which there was a lot of arguing. And so initially, the authors had a defensive stance, right? And so it unfortunately did result in a bit of a tradition of Calvinists coming across as defensive or knowing everything. And that stereotype does persist at times today. So have you encountered that, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have encountered that. I like to think about epistemic humility, that we are called to know, but to know with humility. So there's a whole lot about Reformed theology about which I am passionate, but the reality is it's very complex, and these discussions should be had with care and compassion and patience and a willingness to dialogue. If you remember, I came to Park Road from a United Methodist church in South Carolina. Methodists and Presbyterians traditionally get along like cats and dogs, or oil and water, or Eagles and Cowboys fans. They're very, very different. I found tremendous value in serving in a Methodist context, still have a lot of really good Methodist friends. I believe there's tremendous value that happens when we dialogue across the aisle, as it were.
And that idea of complexity of theology is another critique at times. And sometimes, as you said, Reformed theology is a wide field, and there's a lot in there.
Yeah.
So how do we manage that idea of complexity? Is that a critique or is that a strength?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I think it's both. I think that, I think that Reformed theology often gets talked about like it's overly complex, and if we can boil it down to the essentials, I think just about God's sovereignty. The good news that God is a sovereign God, that God saves, that He did not make us savable and then punt the ball back to us to take up the rest of the work, that we are saved by Christ finally, and salvation is by God's grace through faith. And John Packer once wrote, of Calvinism, there is really only one point to be made, and that point is that God saves sinners. So I forget who it was that said that the gospel is like a puddle of water that is so safe a baby could play in, but so deep an elephant could drown in. And so I think about Reformed theology that it is, all systems of theology are complex, but there is beautiful simplicity in the good news to know that with the sovereignty of God and the salvation of sinners, that Christ saves us, and we are saved by grace through faith. That's simple news, and it's good news.
Amen. Yeah. Well, final question. Many of us here at Park Road come from non-Reformed backgrounds. So do we need to fully embrace every point of TULIP to be a covenant partner here at Park Road?
Yes, I need to see your John Calvin tattoo before you join. No, absolutely not. I think that Park Road is a place where lots of people from lots of traditions have come and enjoy the fellowship and the worship and the teaching. We will always clearly talk about the bigness, the sovereignty of God, salvation by God's grace through faith. But our central tenet is Jesus, and Jesus alone, right? We sing in Christ alone. And so we who profess Christ, who believe in salvation by grace through faith, Those are the important ones. We are always happy to dialogue about Reformed theology, but you do not need to be a 5-point or sign on the dotted line to join. Absolutely not.
Very good.
Anything else?
I think that's all for today.
Well, thanks for your patience. If you do have questions, please do email us. We'd love to talk with you further. And then otherwise, stay tuned until next week for installment 2.